About 10 years ago, a new neighbor moved into the house across from us, in my old neighborhood. She was a woman in her mid-40s who lived alone and rarely interacted with others. If someone greeted her, she would smile and respond politely, but she didn't seem interested in making friends. She often stayed inside her house, and when she did come outside, it was usually for short walks or to get her mail. Although she appeared friendly, there was something a little odd about the way she acted. Now, normally I would play with my friends in the front yard, running around and having fun, while she sat on her patio and observed us for hours without hiding it. Sometimes we would glance over and see her just sitting there, staring at us with a blank expression. If she wasn't on the patio, she would peek through her curtains, trying to see what we were doing. So it felt like she was watching us all the time, even when we were inside our house. Then one night, I was sitting in the den with my parents, watching TV and enjoying our time together, when suddenly we noticed the lights in front of our house turn on, and we saw a shadow moving in the window. It seemed like someone was outside, but we couldn't see their face clearly. My dad got up to check what was happening. By the time he reached the front door, the person had disappeared. He glanced around, but didn't see anything unusual. We talked about it for a moment, but then we brushed it off and decided to go to sleep, thinking it was probably nothing. The next morning, as my dad was leaving for work early, he noticed that our solar panel lights, which were stuck in the lawn next to our driveway, were missing. The ground where they had been was still disturbed, with loose soil showing where they had been pulled out. As he backed out of the driveway, he glanced over at our neighbor's driveway and saw all 5 of our solar panel lights lined up neatly there, just like we had them in our yard. He was so amused that he called my mom and me, who were still asleep, to come see for ourselves. We rubbed our eyes and walked outside, still half asleep. Sure enough, our solar lights were stuck in the neighbor's yard, but we didn't say anything because we're not the type to confront people. And after all, they were just cheap lights, not worth much. The neighbor was outside, acting as normal as ever, watering her flowers. We exchanged awkward glances and decided to just let it go. Every day she would smile, wave, and make small talk with us, as if nothing was wrong. After the incident with the lights, we started to notice other strange things. Our Christmas and Halloween decorations would get damaged or disappear almost every year, which felt odd since no one else on our block had the same problem. For example, one Halloween, our carved pumpkins went missing the night before the holiday. So eventually we decided to stop decorating altogether to avoid more issues. We also noticed that our neighbor seemed to copy almost everything we did, from how we arranged our flowers in the garden to the games we played outside. If we bought a garden gnome, she would have one in her yard the next day. If my mom wore a sun hat, she would wear one too. If my parents and I were outside raking leaves, she would come out and do the same. Still, we never confronted her about anything or treated her differently, because she didn't seem like a threat. Over the years we lived there, she did many other strange things, but they're not really worth mentioning. We moved away from that neighborhood, and fortunately our current neighbor is kind and respectful. About 4 years ago, I was living alone as a single mom, and my house is a little outside of town. It's not too far away, but it's also not close enough to walk to the main part of town. I have a few neighbors nearby, and we see each other from time to time. Most people in the area know each other well. But one night while I was staying up late, something unusual took place that I'll never forget. I was washing dishes and cleaning up because my son had already gone to bed for the night. I had let my dog, Goldie, outside to explore. There's a big field next to my house, and Goldie loves running and playing there. As I was washing the dishes, I listened to the radio and hummed along with the music. It was a quiet night, and I was focused on getting the house in order before heading to bed myself. I went outside to call my dog back to the house. She often goes to the far end of the property, so it's normal for me to call her a few times before she runs back. While I was calling her, I noticed a small light in the field that I had never seen before, and it seemed like someone was using a flashlight. I felt a bit uneasy, so I stayed close to the lights on my property. My neighbor across the street could see me if he looked outside, and that made me feel a little safer, even if it didn't really make sense. I called Goldie 3 times, shouting loudly, because I didn't want to go into the dark to find her. After a few minutes of waiting, I listened closely for the sound of her paws hitting the ground. But then something weird happened. I heard a faint male voice coming from the direction of the light, calling my dog back toward the field. It wasn't a voice I recognize, and I could see Goldie now. She was standing about halfway between me and where the light was, hesitating as if unsure whether to come to me or go toward the voice. I was getting really scared, but I wasn't going to let anyone hurt Goldie or me, so I shouted as loud as I could. She wiggled her little tail and quickly ran over to me. As soon as she reached me, I grabbed her and hurried into the house, locking the door behind us. I stayed inside the house and turned off all the lights so I could see outside without anyone seeing me. My heart was pounding, but I stayed focused. I grabbed my baseball bat, holding it tightly, ready to defend myself if needed. Then I walked around the house to ensure that all the doors and windows were locked. After securing everything, I took a quick glance out the side window to check if the light in the field was still there. I didn't see it. About 10 minutes had passed since I got inside. I turned on a small light in the kitchen to make it easier to see while I washed the dishes. But I kept my baseball bat next to me on the counter, ready to use if I needed it. I focused on the dishes, scrubbing away and trying to calm my nerves. About 30 minutes went by, and I was finally starting to feel a little more relaxed. Just as I was wiping my hands on a dish towel, I suddenly heard a very loud crash coming from my garage. I quickly walked into the living room and called the neighbor across the street. I asked him if he could peek out his front window to see if anyone was outside near my garage. I explained that I was planning to turn on the lights in the garage and press the button in the laundry room to open the door. I have a button inside the house, so I don't have to go outside, and there's also one on my car visor for when I'm outside. He agreed to help but sounded really worried. I quietly walked to the laundry room door that leads into the garage. Then I pressed the button on the inside of the door, and as soon as I did, the garage light flickered on. Then my neighbor suddenly freaked out. His voice was loud and panicked as he told me there was a man. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, and I quickly glanced around the garage. At this point, I was just inside the laundry room, gripping my baseball bat tightly in my hand. My heart was racing as I opened the door quickly. When I looked inside, I saw a guy trying really hard and very foolishly to hide by the side of my car. I slowly started to walk around the car, keeping the bat raised and ready to use. As I moved closer, I said firmly, "I know you're over there, so don't try to hide. You are trespassing on private property. This is my home, and if you don't leave, I will call the police." When I told him that, the guy just stood up like everything was normal and walked out of my garage like a gentleman, saying, "Hey, sorry to disturb you, but I'm just a friendly neighbor and came here to look around your house." I didn't reply and closed the garage door. then checked to see if anything was missing. But fortunately, nothing was gone. But I found the toolbox he had accidentally knocked over, which caused the loud crash I had heard earlier. It looked like his clumsiness got him caught before he could take anything from me. I called the police to let them know there was a man in the area who had broken into my house. From what I saw, he had managed to pry the small garage window open and squeeze inside, leaving it slightly broken. The police arrive, looked around, and asked me a few questions about what happened. After taking my statement, they told me to stay safe and then left to search the area for the guy. Then a few days later, I heard about a guy getting caught for doing the same kind of thing in a nearby area, but I'm not sure if it was him. This happened to my sister when she was in high school. Now she's around 39 years old, so it's been a really long time. She's always been a morning person, and that hasn't changed even today. She would get up as early as 5 a.m. Then she would quietly head to the kitchen, make herself breakfast, and pack her lunch for school. My parents usually wake up at 7 a.m. and start their day with coffee and breakfast. However, the rest of us wake up really late. My sister doesn't want to bother our parents, so she does everything by herself, makes her own breakfast, and packs her lunch without asking for help. Then one morning, after she finished preparing her food for school, she sat by the side door of our house, looking out for the school bus to arrive. Now, we rarely use the main door in the morning, and when you sit by the side door, you can see our neighbor's house. At that time, our neighbor had already moved out for a month or more, and there was an old wooden bench outside their house, weathered and covered in dust. My sister saw two women sitting on the bench, but they were facing away from her, so she could only see their backs. They seemed to be talking softly to each other, their voices blending with the sounds of the morning. She couldn't see what the women were wearing. The only thing she could see was their hair. Their hair wasn't very long, but it looked messy. She said it seemed like someone who hadn't brushed their hair in a long time. The hair was medium length, dark in color, and very big. She heard them talking, but it was in a strange language she didn't understand. No language sounded like what the two women were talking about, and it seemed like they were arguing. Their voices were loud and sharp, which made my sister a bit uneasy. She doesn't really believe in ghosts, so she was curious to know what was happening. She stayed there, sitting quietly by the side door, and listened carefully to their conversation. It was hard to make out the words, but she could hear their tones getting more intense. Then at one point, she remembered that our neighbor had already moved out, and that no one was living next door. She thought maybe it was just some random people hanging out at that house. But that seemed impossible because it would be intruding on someone else's property, since the house wasn't for sale. Then for some reason, she picked up some stones and started throwing them at the women, trying to get their attention. Maybe the women noticed my sister throwing stones at them because they suddenly stopped talking, but they didn't move from the bench at all. Minutes passed, and the two women slowly turned their heads toward her. As they did, my sister's heart raced, and she felt nervous. Halfway through turning, they laughed, but it wasn't a loud laugh. It was more like a soft, creepy chuckle that sent shivers down her back. She said she had never been that scared in her whole life. Before the women even turned their heads completely, my sister quickly ran to my parents' room and woke my dad up. But when my dad went outside to check, the women were no longer there. So they waited, hoping the women would come back, but unfortunately, they didn't appear again. My dad checked the front and back of the house, but no one was there at all. He believed my sister's story because the house had been empty for more than a month. He thought maybe some restless spirit wanted to take over that house, especially since it looked so lonely and abandoned. The windows were dusty, and the garden was overgrown. If the women were real people, they couldn't have gone far. He also pointed out that they couldn't enter the house since it was completely locked, with all the doors and windows secured tight. A few years ago, a nice family bought the house. They knocked down the old building and built a brand new house. However, they stayed for less than a month and then moved out. We never found out why they left. They often gave us nervous smiles when we saw them. After they moved out, the house wasn't for sale or rent anymore. I don't know where to begin with this, but I'll try to explain everything I remember. It happened this morning, so it's still fresh in my mind. I woke up feeling a bit off, and since then I've been searching online for answers all day. I've looked through different websites, tried reading forums, and even watched some videos, but I still haven't found anything helpful. The more I search, the more I feel like I'm losing my mind. The closest thing I found was a post from about 3 years ago, but it had nothing to do with what I'm going through. Anyway, I've always been a late riser, and with this work-from-home situation, I can choose my own sleep schedule, so I usually stay up late and wake up late. When I finally got up this morning, though it was probably closer to noon, the house felt really quiet, and I realized my family wasn't home. I didn't hear any sounds like I normally do, and it felt a bit strange, but I didn't think much of it at first. This isn't unusual, because by the time I wake up, my wife and the kids are usually busy with their own things. I'm used to them being out or doing something around the house. But when I went to make a bagel, I noticed the back door was wide open. I thought maybe she had taken the kids outside to play in the yard, so I decided to check. But when I glanced around, no one was there, not in the yard or anywhere nearby. I mumbled to myself about her leaving the door open, since the bugs are pretty bad here, and then I went ahead and closed it. Right after I turned around from closing the back door, I noticed that the front door was wide open too. I could see both cars in the driveway through the open door, and it seemed odd to me. So I went to check if my family was outside in the front yard, thinking maybe they were playing or chatting with a neighbor. But when I looked, I didn't see anyone. I began to worry and think the worst. Across the street, I noticed our neighbor's front door was open too. We are really close with our neighbors. The dad is a childhood friend of mine, and our kids have known each other since they were born. I figured my family might be over there, so I walked over and knocked on their front door before going in. I called out their names, but when I stepped inside, the house was empty. The living room was quiet, and I didn't see or hear anyone. There was not a single sign of them. At this point, I started to feel panicked. All the doors were wide open, and my neighbor's house was in the same situation. All their cars were there too. My heart was racing as I walked back across the street to grab my phone, hoping I could call someone for help. That's when I noticed the house next to mine also had its front door wide open. At that moment, I completely lost it. I felt like I was in a horror movie or something. I looked down the street, and every single front door I could see was open, but not a single person was around. I hurried back inside and went to my room to get my phone, which was charging from the night before. As soon as I pulled it off the charger and unlocked it, I heard the front door open and my wife and kids' muffled voices. I ran to the kitchen and found my wife holding bags of groceries. I felt relieved to see her, but confused, so I asked her where she and the kids had been. and how they went anywhere without using one of the cars. She looked at me like I was silly and said she took her own car and had been gone for about an hour. I explained everything that had happened, the open doors, the quiet houses, and how I thought something was wrong in the neighborhood. But even after all that, she still just looked at me like I was being ridiculous. I felt frustrated because I wanted her to understand how worried I had been. She asked me if I was sure it wasn't a dream. I was completely sure I wasn't dreaming. There was no doubt about it. I could remember every detail clearly. She said she believed me, and that we could look into it together. But I could tell she didn't really believe me. I understood why. Who could blame her? I know I sound like a crazy person. Just thinking about everything that happened made my heart race. Later, I talked to my friend across the street. He said he and his family had been home all day, which surprised me. I thought maybe they had seen my family or knew where they were. But when I went to look for my family earlier, there was clearly nobody.